There we go. Last week, I had a conversation with Karen, and we were lamenting the fact that the lectionary gave us really hard texts, and Margie and Michael got the good ones. And, Karen, your sermon last week and dealing with the whole meat to idols was great. And I was looking at my texts, and I've been ruminating on them for weeks, and I had no idea what I was going to come up here and say, which text I was going to choose up until a few days ago. And I decided, obviously, let's just go with all of them. And the reason I picked all of them, hopefully will become abundantly clear, and hopefully I did not bite off more than I can chew this morning. I believe that the two main lenses surrounding around how the language about the divine has come to pass are humanity's understanding of cosmology and politics. And we see that reflected in the scripture. In fact, one of the most eye-opening things for me in my journey through scripture and how my worldview has changed within that is understanding that at the center of a lot of these things that we read in the Bible is power dynamics. And as I lived my life, understanding that my place in certain organizations, sometimes even in my own family, comes down to power dynamics. And it's an uncomfortable realization to come through, because if you read through the Hebrew scriptures, you have kings and empires, and the language about how the writers of the Hebrew scriptures communicate God has directly to do with where they are as a place. Are they under occupation, or are they in power? And then that reflects the language that is used to describe God. Is God a conquering king, or is God a redeemer? Well, it depends. Do you need to be redeemed? Are you the one in power at the moment? And I think that remains true as we move forward, is that our understanding of the universe and our understanding of the nuance of the power structures within a given society, they do affect the way that we view and look at God, the divine. And it's interesting because then Jesus begins to challenge those power dynamics. Much of Jesus' teaching is all about reversal, especially the Sermon on the Mount, is that you've heard it said this way, but no, this is true. Flipping things on their end, and that's great. But then that's left for the next people to come, okay, now that everything's been flipped over, how do we clean it back up again and prevent ourselves from creating new power structures that oppress and keep people down? And that was the early church was left with that. And yay, we got Paul to help us with that. The Bible, in a lot of ways, is like going back to a beloved sitcom years later and realizing, oh, that is not good. That does not age well. It's, and a lot of that is because it is so of its time, it can't be timeless. And the Bible's a lot of that, because ultimately the text is intimately connected in so many ways to its socio-political context. Cultural relevancy is sometimes the enemy of timelessness. And the Bible is a victim of that, for better or worse, because power dynamics and social structures shift. And if you are trying to speak, for instance, as a prophet in the Hebrew scriptures, if you are trying to speak to a current moment, to a current situation, eventually it's not going to feel current, because the needs of the moment need to be addressed. And obviously there's nuance there. I don't mean to oversimplify this, and you can't help but do that a little bit when you're preaching a sermon and you're confined to a certain amount of time. But we see that reflected in all of these different texts. We can dig, but it takes work to find the timeless aspects of these stories. But they can also be lost in the specificity of these cultural contexts. The text that we looked at today, in the Isaiah text, is God really using the "do you know who I am" argument? And in Psalms, does safety and economic prosperity as a bargaining chip with the masses sound familiar? In the Corinthians, there goes Paul again, using strict binaries to describe everything that he wants: Jew, Gentile, slave, master, spirit, flesh, weak, strong. Paul. And then Mark. Jesus did what? He rose someone from the dead so they could get him some food. I don't know how all this works, but in between the lines of all these texts that we read this morning is a reflection of some sort of power dynamic, some sort of understanding of the culture in which they lived in. And it is sometimes a minefield to work through in anything, whether it's a favorite sitcom or whether it's the Bible itself. And it can be difficult. All right, Jeff, that's a neat little Bible lesson. We get it. But what does that have to do with us? Well, I think that in our own lives, we are always and constantly dealing with power dynamics. There are all kinds of different power that we hold as individuals. Money, fame, political power, race, gender, age, experience, location, country, all of these things are under this umbrella of power dynamics. Some of us are born on third base. Some of us not so much. And then how do we maneuver through that, especially in today's landscape? It's really, really hard work. It is not easy to live up to the values that we surround ourselves with each week. But how we manage the power that we've been given is a key part to that. We ask ourselves, are we ignorant of the power that we hold? Are we dismissive of the power that we hold and therefore dismissive of those who call us out on it? Do we strive to empower others, or are we more concerned with displaying our power to others? What can we do? I don't know if you've seen me lately, but I'm a white male. And also a heterosexual male. And in our society, that's like being born on third base. And I was born into a power dynamic that I didn't choose, but I moved forward and maneuver through it. And I could sit there, like many, and we've seen this happen over and over again. I can sit there and be like, woe is me, because my power is being taken away, and I don't have the voice that I once had, and whatever millions or trillions of excuses that people feel when they don't feel like they're being heard like they used to. But there are two things that when we struggle with this idea of power dynamics. We struggle in our own life and in the organizations that we're a part of. How do we maneuver through these things? I think there are two things that we can take into account that'll help us maneuver through, at least start us to, because this is really difficult. And if I'm stammering my words, it's because it's really difficult. There are countless of resources and books and philosophers and how we deal and maneuver with one another, especially when we're dealing and working with differences and who in a society has more power than someone else. But for us in our context, there are two things. I think how we, being more mindful of how we speak about the divine. It's hard to undo centuries of language about God. But if our language around God becomes so disconnected from the world that we live in, where does that leave the future of the church, the future of Christianity? Because as we saw represented in the text this morning, the language around God evolved as society and people and circumstances evolved. But for some reason, there seems to be at some point there was this stopping point. It's like, okay, let's just keep this language now and not progress, which is why I love the UCC. There's a lot of our hymns. It's frustrating from a workflow standpoint when we're trying to put words up there and there's like a million different versions of a particular song. But I love the fact that we allow ourselves, we give ourselves the permission to change these words so that they can become words that are more reflective of how we interact with one another and how we interact with the divine today. But I think the most important thing is that how do we really live into our value of diversity? Because I grew up in an era called the colorblind era. I'm a 90s kid. So it was all, well, we don't see color, you can make a banner, you can put it on a t-shirt or whatever, because that was the idea, was that, oh, no, we're all one. We're all coming together. All of our differences we don't see anymore. And I think that is a flawed perspective, because it's not about not seeing the differences. It's about it's not even about understanding them. It's about accepting them. It's about listening. Listening is one way that we can dismantle our power structures. Everyone's voice may be important, but not in every moment. Sometimes we need to read the room. Sometimes we need to understand whose voice needs priority so that we can co-flourish in this moment. How do we see the context? And there's a lot of material out there about listening to understand, listening to be empathetic, and not listening to react, which I think are all good things. But the question we need to ask ourselves is, what is it we mean when we say we're understanding? Is our understanding the goal to relate? Or is our understanding simply for the goal of allowing someone else to feel heard and accepted? Because depending upon where we stand in this society, whether it's power we've been given or it's power we've been born into, there are some things that we will never understand or relate to. There are experiences out there that I will never fully understand. And to act like I do or to pretend that I do does a disservice to the people who are actually experiencing those things. Because my goal of understanding and my listening is not so that I can relate. It's so that I can be a place where someone can feel heard. And when someone feels heard, they are empowered. They are seen. And we obviously live in a society where not everyone is heard. Not everyone is seen. And sometimes all we can do is just be that one person in someone's day who acknowledges who they are to their fullest. And it's simply that. But it's difficult because we want to give advice. We want to help someone understand. We want to take our experience and all the things that we have, and we want to impart knowledge. But sometimes we don't need to. Sometimes our relationship with the power that we hold can be a roadblock in others feeling heard. Like with our experience. What makes us so arrogant sometimes to think that we need to understand someone else's experience before we can accept it? What makes us so comfortable with our own experience that we universalize it and assume everyone should have the same experience? Our experience, or lack thereof, does not give us permission to dismiss someone else's. And sometimes we've heard the expression, you can't see the forest for the trees. Well, I think sometimes it's the opposite. I think sometimes we concentrate so much on the big picture that we forget the individuals that make up that big picture. And it's easy to just lump everything together and not appreciate all the difference around us. And it's difficult. These are not easy concepts for us to go through. It's obviously not easy because we read the text that we read today. It's varying understandings. Even within the Hebrew Scriptures, again, I oversimplified it. There are different understandings of power dynamics. There's different understandings of the divine. There's different understandings on how people should interact and where they are. And it's based off of where that person is in the moment. But is the difficulty worth it? Yes. Yes. Even though the more power we have in a given society, the harder it is. And even though our power dynamic shifts within a given day, like maybe at home, you're in charge, but when you go to work, maybe not so much. Or when you're in a place that you're not familiar with, you can feel small, you can feel scared, you can feel like, what's happening around me? Because it's not one or the other. We don't live in these strict binaries of you have power, you don't have power. It's different in all these different places that we have. But it's worth it because if others feel heard, then we know and can be comforted by the fact that we will also be heard, if that's the kind of place that we're cultivating. What we do is hard work, but we believe and want that experience. We want a place where everyone can feel heard, and to the best of our ability, we either exercise our power in the right moments or we know when to step back. But it's all part of the work of gathering together and recognizing and living into the fact that all are truly welcome at the table.